Okay, so let's write the equation with circle in standard form. So let's say we had this one.
Is review for the test?
I'm just doing two problems that's going to be on your test.
Okay.
Okay? It's not review for the test. I'm just kind of discussing something we've had already. All right, we have x squared plus y squared minus 10y, plus 6x plus 2 equals 0. All right, so let's suppose we had that. All right, now this equation that I have here, what kind of equation is this?
Circle.
It's a circle because you have an x squared and a y squared. You
Yes.
see an x squared and a y squared, and the coefficients are 1. So that's the equation of a circle, but it's not in standard form. What form is this? That's general form. So if I want to write this equation that's in general form in standard form, remember standard form is this. It's x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equal r squared. That's the equation, and that's the equation in standard form. So if I want to go from here to here, what is it I've got to do? What's that process called? I've got to do what? Complete the square. I've got to complete the square. So in your test, it's not going to say complete the square. It's going to say what I just did, right, in standard form. All right, now when completing the square, you're going to put the terms with x's together and the terms with y's together. And what else do you want to do? Put the constant to the other side. So I have x squared plus 6x, leave some space. And then I have plus y squared minus 10y, leave some space. And what's going to be on that other side? Negative 2. All right, now what's the next step? Take the coefficient of x, which is 6, and I do what to that? Divide by 2, and whatever that is, I square it. So that's going to be 3 squared, which is 9. So what do I do to this 9? I add it to both sides. So I'm going to say x squared plus 6x. I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this thing over. So I'm going to add 9, and then add 9. All right, now the purpose of completing the square in the variables is to get this trinomial to be a perfect square trinomial. So remember, a perfect square trinomial is a trinomial that can be written as a binomial squared. So what is this binomial that goes in here so that when I square it, when I multiply it by itself, I get this trinomial? X plus 3. Because x plus 3 times x plus 3 is this trinomial. All right, so I have this part already of this standard form. So that is this part here. All right, now over here, I do the same thing. I complete the square in the y's. So the coefficient of y is negative 10. I take half of that, and then whatever that is, I square it. So that's negative 5 squared, which is 25. So I add 25 to both sides. And again, if I'm doing this correctly, this should now be a perfect square trinomial. So what will be this binomial? Y minus 5. Y minus 5 times y minus 5 is this trinomial. And that's going to equal the other side, which is 32. All right, now remember what we just found. So remember, I'm trying to write this equation in general form, in standard form, right? So remember, this right here, this right here is standard form. You're done with standard form. This is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. That 32 represents what part of this formula? R squared. Doesn't represent r, it represents r squared. So your radius is not 32. R squared equals 32. Okay? So that's your equation. Now, if you're asked to find the center, what will be the center? Negative 3, 5. So it's not 3, 5, right? Because it's got to be x minus h. So remember, x plus 3 is the same as x minus a what? Negative 3. So this part right here is your h. And then y minus 5, so this part right here is already your k, because it's already written in the form y minus. But what's the radius?
4 square root
Just go ahead and tell me what to do.
32.
The radius is not 32. The radius is what? Square root of 32. Because remember, this 32 represents r squared, right? X minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. That is your r squared. So you need to write out what we just said. R squared equals what number? 32. So how do you find the radius? The radius would be what?
Square root.
The square root of 32. But you're also going to be asked to simplify this. So what perfect square goes in at 32?
16.
16. So the square root is 16 times 2. And what's the square root of 16?
4.
So you get 4 square root of 2. So the radius is 4 square root of 2. All right, and then if you're asked to approximate this to 2 decimal places, so to 2 decimal places, what I would do is I would just use the square root of 32. So the square root of 32, you get 5.66. Now some of you don't know how to round off. A few of you. So it says round to 2 decimal places, right? So if this is what you have, is the answer going to be 5.65 or 5.66? 5.66, because 2 decimal places means a hundredths place. So you have to look at the thousandths place. If the thousandths place, if the digits 5 or greater, then you got to add 1 to this hundredths place. All right, so I noticed that on a couple of worksheets that was turned in already. All right, so that's your radius. All right, so some of you are getting confused about what this number right here represents. This number does not represent r. This number represents r squared. That's your formula. See, your formula says r squared. It didn't say r, it says r squared. So r squared is 32. All right, then the other thing you have to be able to do on your test, on test 2, is something like this. Suppose that the endpoints of the diameter of a circle are, I'm making this up, let's say -3, 4, and -1, 5. All right, making this up. Well, let me go ahead and do, let's say -5. -5. Go ahead and put that -5. All right, so in your mind, you have this circle with a diameter that has those endpoints. And we did one where we drew it last class period. So we drew this diagram. But if I'm going to and the directions will be write the equation of the circle. Write the equation of this circle in standard form. All right, well, first of all, you need to know what standard form is. What's the form of a circle in standard form?
X minus h squared.
X minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. And in order to use this, you need to know 2 things. What 2 things must you know? You have to know the center and the what? And the radius. That's what you have to find. So in both cases, I don't know any of them. All I know is that these are the diameters of the circle, the endpoints of the diameter of a circle. So how can I find the center? All right, so remember the diameter goes to the center, right? The diameter goes to the center. So if I can find the midpoint of this segment, then that's the center. So what's the formula for midpoint? So remember, midpoint is a point. So I noticed that some of you, when you put your center, you didn't put parentheses. Remember, it's a point, so you need parentheses. So to find the midpoint, you add your x coordinates together, and it does not matter the order in which you do this, but you got to divide by 2, comma, and then you do the same thing with the y's.
Order doesn't matter.
Right, because addition is commutative. Order does not matter. All right, it helps if you label these, so it'll be x1, y1, x2, y2. So I'm going to get in parentheses x1, what's x1? Plus a negative 1 divided by 2, comma, then 4 plus a negative 5 divided by 2. So that's going to be negative 3 plus a negative 1 is a negative 4, right? And what's a negative 4 half divided by 2? Negative 2. Here, what's 4 plus a negative 5? Negative 1, so you get negative 1 half, right? All right, so that's the center. So what I found was my h and my k. All right, now let's find the radius. How do you find the radius, the length of the radius? You're going to use the distance formula. So the distance formula is the square root, and here you subtract your x coordinates from each other, and you square whatever that number is, plus, and then you do the same thing with the y coordinates. Now remember, we derived this last class period. We saw where this came from. So you had to, remember we used Pythagorean's theorem at one point? That's where this comes from. And so you just subtract your x coordinates, so it'll be x2, which is a negative 1. Subtract x1, what's x1? Negative 3, whatever that is, I square it. Plus y2, what's y2? Negative 5. Subtract y1, which is 4, and I square that. Okay? So I get the square root of, now what's a negative 1 subtract the negative 3? That's negative 1 plus 3. And then here, that's negative 5 and a negative 4 is a negative 9, right? So I get the square root of, what's negative 1 plus 3?
2.
All right, so I get 2 squared plus a negative 9 squared. So that becomes a square root of 4 plus 81, which is a square root of 85. All right. Now, what does that square root of 85 represent? The length of the diameter. You have to remember that I need to know the length of the radius. Well, we know from a geometry course that the radius is half the diameter. So if the diameter is the square root of 85, and don't simplify the square root of 85 because at some point you're going to square that number. So the radius is half the diameter, so the radius here, the length of the radius is the square root of 85 divided by 2. Okay? That's the length of the radius. Notice, mathematically, I wrote this correctly. All right, now, let's plug all this information back into the formula. I'm still not done because what is it I wanted to do? I want to put this equation in standard form. I want to write the circle in standard form. So remember, this is standard form right here. So you're going to say x minus h, what's h?
Negative 2.
Negative 2 squared plus y minus k, which is a negative 1 half squared, equals the radius. What's the radius?
8, square root 8.
Square root of 85 divided by 2. And what must I do to that radius? Square it. Now don't leave your answer like this. I expect you to simplify some things. For example, you need to know that x subtract negative 2 means x plus 2. Y subtract negative 1 means y. Y subtract negative 1 half means y plus 1 half. And then here, you need to remember that this right here is being squared, right? Square root of 85 over 2. So that means square root of 85 divided by 2, that's 85, times itself. Well, what's the square root of 85 and square root of 85? 85. What's 2 times 2?
4.
So that goes here. So that's your answer. Okay. All right, so that was a quick review on circles. You're going to see that on test 2. You're going to have a problem with diameter. You have a problem with completing the square. So those should be easy points to get as long as you practice on this before the test. Okay? All right, so that takes care of that part.